Students and politicians alike are protesting recent proposed increases in university tuition in California. The UC regents claim they need more money from the state to fund the UC system. Leaders in Sacramento claim they need to find more ways to lower costs without raising tuition. I'm Stick Schoolteacher Sue, our education expert.
I'm Stick Senator Sara, our political expert.
And I'm Stick Stockbroker Steve, our financial expert. Today we'll be starting a discussion on state funding of education in California and asking what needs to happen to make higher education affordable in California. Sue, can you tell us about these tuition increases?
Sure, you can see in these graphs, inflation-adjusted tuition costs have roughly tripled over the last 30 years. The biggest spike, as you can clearly see, has been in the last few years, as a result of the recent recession. The recent proposed tuition increases would increase annual tuition costs by several $1,000s over the next several years.
I see. Sara, didn't we pass Prop 32.5 years ago to prevent the need to increase tuition in California colleges? The proposition was supposed to increase state revenue by as much as $9 billion. We were told that passing that proposition would protect our school funding.
That was how it was advertised, but let's take a look at how the state has actually spent that money. Here we see state funding for higher education over the last few years, as well as proposed funding for next year. You can see state funding dropping significantly since 2007.
I see that, but we really don't see the bump in 2012 that we were supposed to see in education spending. Even now, in the proposed budget for next year, they haven't brought spending back up to where it was before the recession.
That's correct. Really all Prop 30 did was prevent university funding from dropping even more, in exchange for not raising tuition that year. You can see, education funding as a percentage of the state budget has been dropping consistently for the last 40 years, and we're nowhere close to restoring it. As it stands now, the state actually contributes less to most university programs than student tuition does, compared to 40 years ago, where tuition and fees in the UC system were $630 for undergraduate California residents.
But I know state spending increased significantly in the last few years as we recover from the recession. What has that money been spent on?
Right, let's take a look at health and human services spending compared to school spending.
Wait a second. I see in the year we were supposed to be restoring funding for schools, we actually increased health and human services spending by over $8 billion.
That wasn't the only increase. You can also see increases in other spending categories.
How does this spending compare to other spending we had for labor and workforce development? I know the federal government gave substantial money to California during the recession to help with unemployment problems.
Well, here we can see how funding for Employee Development Department compares to college spending.
Wow, that is impressive. It seems ironic that in a time where students are graduating with more debt, as well as having a hard time finding jobs, we are spending tens of billions more on unemployment and job training, rather than lowering the cost of college.
That brings us to an interesting question. How much would the state have to spend on college education to lower tuition back down to the levels we saw in 1975?
Well, if you estimate total enrollment in the UC system as about 250,000 students, $2 billion would reduce every student's tuition by $8,000 a year. Let's do some calculations now. If state funding for education has dropped from over 15% to less than 10% in the last 40 years.
That would be the equivalent of more than $8 billion decrease in college spending.
That's interesting. So, in theory, that revenue increase from Proposition 30 could have actually restored education to the funding levels we had back in the 70s.
That's correct. It seems like the position the UC regents are taking is correct. The need for the tuition increases for our colleges can be explained entirely from the lack of state funding.
That does make sense. We do know that universities have been doing everything they could to lower costs. They've shifted to hiring part-time adjunct faculty because they are cheaper, and have been pushing for higher student-to-teacher ratios. Many people are complaining that these changes are lowering the quality of education for many of our students. But it simply isn't enough to absorb the massive cuts the university system has seen over the last 40 years.
Sara, is there a reason for this drop in education spending?
Well, politicians are primarily motivated by things that get them elected. Students and teachers are not a significant voting population, so it doesn't help to appeal to them in elections. They also aren't a very significant source of campaign funding. In short, funding education doesn't help politicians get elected.
Well, the governor does appoint people to positions overseeing education spending, such as the Board of UC Regents. Don't they have any negotiating power with the state?
Unfortunately, those positions are typically given to people as political favors, rather than awarded based on merit. They often can involve substantial conflicts of interest as well. For example, investment banker Richard Blum, who is married to California Senator Dianne Feinstein, has been regularly accused of taking advantage of connections with the government to gain government contracts, and is a controlling shareholder of Career Education Corporation, a for-profit educational company. Monique Lozano, another UC regent, is also a trustee for a private university, the University of Southern California. These are individuals who stand to benefit if the public university system is poorly funded, because it makes their universities more competitive. Meanwhile, faculty who actually work for the UC system aren't allowed to serve as UC regents, because that would be considered a conflict of interest.
That is very interesting. It seems like in this case, the problems with conflict of interest are backwards. People who have an interest in the university doing well are not allowed to be in charge, but people who have an interest in the university doing poorly are. It's no wonder the California public universities haven't been able to get sufficient funding from the state. It is rather concerning that the state would lie so blatantly about education funding, though.
Well, looking at these numbers, I think I might have an explanation. I couldn't help but notice that the line item for higher education spending was right next to the line item for health and human services spending in our state budget. What if the problem is that California politicians are just getting those two categories mixed up? They think they're funding education, but they aren't looking at the right line.
That might be possible. Since California has been lowering education spending for the past 40 years, it's possible we now have senators that aren't very good at reading.
So maybe the best way to get the state to restore education spending and prevent the need for increasing student tuition is for everyone to write to their state representatives and tell them not to get those lines mixed up, and that they need to spend enough money on education to keep our schools running.
But if they are having trouble reading the different categories in their budget, chances are they won't read emails we write either.
In that case, we should wait for the next election and make sure we vote for people who know how to read. What do you think, Sarah?
I think it would be good to have elected officials that know how to read. It will help stop problems like this.
Our diligent staff has been trying to read it and absorb it, and is having a great deal of difficulty sifting through this complicated 850-page bill.
You have 29 loopholes in this bill.
So this is page 65 of the bill. Subparagraph B here, capital B, waiver. Subparagraph little I.
You have a 1,500-page bill that nobody's read.
B, C, D, little I, E, G, H, or I.
American way. These damn bills that come out here all the damn time come out here at the last second, and I gotta try to figure out how to vote for my people.
This is gobbledygook.
Well, this was certainly an interesting discussion. Hopefully we can continue this discussion in future meetings, to examine the costs of California universities in more detail, as well as the selection process of the people who oversee them.